This is the Skin Science Podcast. I'm Dr. Thomas Hitchcock, and here we'll investigate everything skin science and dissect it from a scientific perspective, analyze it from a medical perspective, critique it from a consumer perspective, and give insight from an industry perspective. Hello, welcome back to the podcast. I'm Dr. Thomas Hitchcock, and with me in the studio once again is Angela Wilson McDonald. How are you, Angela?
I'm great.
How are you doing on this hot day in Dallas, Texas?
Goodness, this heat wave just never seems to end. Where's the fall?
You should be used to this. You're from Texas.
I know. You never get used to it.
I can't. I've been here 3 years. I still can't get used to it. That's what air conditioning's for.
That is what AC is for.
All right. And we also have Dr. Brian Jones again with us in the studio. How are you doing, Brian?
Doing well, thank you.
Okay. You like the heat?
More than the cold.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, cold always makes it hurt. You know, you can just wear less clothes if it's hot. So, or go into the air conditioning.
Or go in the AC. Except
you can only take so many pieces of clothes off.
When you're really hot, you just kind of lay down.
Brian lives by different standards.
Maybe that's what it is. I guess
cry.
I'm very careful about what I say here. So.
But anyway, so thank you for joining us today. And as I'm wanting to start doing, I'm going to introduce the podcast with one of my new puzzles here. And this one is called The Menace from Deadwood Crafts, Woodcrafts, or Dead Woodcrafts, yes. And so this one is actually it looks really simplistic, and it actually is one of the more simple puzzles, but it's actually deceitful as far as you have to open the box and find the secret compartment. And I'll just do the first step because it's really kind of cool for those of you who are not familiar with puzzles. And so there's a little button there that you can't get to, and so you have to find a tool, and so you're like searching, and you think that this drawer is the only thing that moves, but if you actually press on it in a different spot, it actually comes up. There's actually a little tool there that's held there by a magnet, and you think it's part of the drawer, but it's not, and you can push that down on the button and open it up. And so anyway, this is one of the more simple ones, but also part of the simplicity is the joy, because you actually find these little simple ways to open it, and then when you do your next puzzle, you're now looking for similar mechanisms. Anyway, it's a Menace, Deadwood Crafts, something to look at if you like puzzles. So, the topic for today is one of the ones that we talked about when we have our meeting, our weekly meetings on the podcast, and it's one that Angela seemed to really like a lot. And so we're going to kind of let Angela run the show today.
Yes.
And
finally, I got the keys to the kitchen.
Well, I wouldn't say that. But we're going to let her kind of be the MC here. And we basically, the kind of topic is Mythbusters, the Skin Science edition. And what we want to do is take some kind of, I don't want to say gimmicks, but maybe some trends.
Maybe not a gimmick.
Maybe not a gimmick.
Discuss. Some of these may be very legitimate.
All right. So some trends that we see, especially in the consumer-based in marketing, and whether or not these trends that we're seeing in skin and dermatology and health and skin health are actually legitimate, or are they full of
you know what?
caca.
Or somewhere in between.
Or somewhere in between. Somewhere between caca and legitimate.
Yeah, there you go.
All right. So, Angela, take it away.
Well, and what we tried to do here is I think we all know, we walk through the stores and we see all kinds of products that make certain claims. And, quite honestly, for some of us who are in the industry, it's a bit baffling. But yet you've got friends that call you this. I'm so excited, I just bought this. And you don't want to, let them down by saying, well, this is what Thomas typically does to me. Well, and so, today we thought we'd just take a few of those items and just kind of break it down and discuss, is there any science to the legitimacy of these particular devices, or not even necessarily devices. So let's get started, because I think this is one that I've seen quite a bit of here recently, and for anybody on Instagram, I feel like it comes up all the time. It are rollers, in particular, Thomas and Brian, rollers that are made of jade. Maybe they're made of rose quartz. They generally are just handheld. They're smooth. They might be a little bit soothing, especially if you put them in the refrigerator. You run them over the skin, and they make a lot of claims. They claim to reduce pore size. They claim to improve skin tone. They reduce claim to reduce wrinkles and fine lines. They claim to improve sagging skin. They say they can induce cellular turnover, remove dark circles, and you're going to love this. Here we go again, Thomas. Improve skin immunity. So we're back to the microbiome. So is there anything about a jade roller or a rose quartz roller? Maybe it's the stone itself, maybe it's the action of pressure or a roller over the skin that you believe scientifically can create these types of changes in the skin. Thomas, you want to take the first stab?
Sure, I would love to. And so the first thing I'll say is that you describe me like I described Debbie Downer from Saturday Night Live. Well, all the kids are starving in Africa, so so these rollers where they make them, So, but anyway, when we look at these rollers, and there's not just the jade and the quartz, and they're not just rollers. They also have these tools that are just solid pieces of ceramic or metal or something. They have the globes that you fill with water and you put them in a refrigerator. And a lot of them are meant to do very similar things, which is mechanically massage the face prior to either your skincare routine in the morning or in the evening. And there are all those claims that they make. It doesn't surprise me that these consumer brands would make a lot of these claims to try to get people to sell theirs, because they're basically commodities that a lot of them are made like overseas in large quantities and sold to the same different companies, the same basic devices, and so it's their way of basically trying to hang their hat on something that the other groups can't. But when all of them kind of do that, I mean, what's the point? Because you can't follow. Really, realistically, it's not going to do all that laundry list of things. However, that being said, there is something to some of what these things can do for you. Maybe not that laundry list, but when you wake up in the morning, there's a few things that people may notice. And I mean, I don't know what you notice, but I tend to always notice that I have a little bit more puffiness or edema than I did when I went to bed, especially if I ate salty foods or whatever. And so if you understand what makes you puffy, then you can start to think about, okay, well, do these tools have some utility to reduce puffiness? And it's not necessarily by any proprietary blend or
stone characteristic or anything
property,
like
a crystal that has like magic powers. I mean, although some of them have claimed like there is a movement for crystals and stuff like that, but
there's following of crystals.
And I don't want to like poo-poo people's fantasies and stuff like that, but
fantasies maybe.
But
you kind of already did by calling them fantasies.
Well, but the thing is, one of the things that is done when you're massaging is we have a whole network of vessels in our bodies called lymphatics. So the lymphatic system, and it's interesting because people may have heard of that, but they may not understand like the lymph nodes and everything. The lymphatic system is a pretty interesting. A lot of them follow our circulatory vessels as well. And so lymphatics our blood vessels are not perfect. They do leak, and some of the stuff that leaks out into what we call the interstitial space of the tissues. So basically we accumulate some of the blood plasma liquid in our tissues, and that leads us to, when we get a lot in there, we call it edema, when it's a lot of liquid in there. If you block a lymphatic vessel that can't drain away that liquid, you have probably heard of something called elephantiasis. Is it elephantiasis or elephantitis? I think it's
elephantitis.
Titus, yes. Yeah. I think one's the condition or whatever. But anyway, I just want to make sure that I don't say something.
Friends with scientists.
Yeah, but
discussions you get into.
Regardless, it's because those people, like for instance, when a woman has breast cancer, as I'm aware. If they remove lymph nodes, a lot of them have to wear compression garments because lymph nodes are part of the lymphatic system, and if you remove the ability to remove that liquid, they can start to swell and get elephantitis.
I don't have that.
And so, or swelling edema, they'll call it edema. I guess elephantitis wouldn't be when you just have simple edema, but
but just swelling.
Swelling, yeah. And so, there's some more exotic forms of this that are caused by parasites like schistosoma, I believe they're called. We won't get into, but there's some interesting places where you can have this happen. Regardless, and you can use your imagination for that. But regardless, by massaging the tissue, it's well known that you can actually relieve edema because you're actually pushing liquid into the lymphatics and pushing that liquid away from the tissue and putting it back into the circulation. Because basically the lymphatics, it's like a reverse, like with Stranger Things, you have the upside down. The lymphatics are like the upside down of the blood vessels where you put all the liquid back in there, and eventually will go back into a main vessel that will go back into the blood. And so the lymphatic system is very important. It even has like little valves like the vasculature, the veins do. And so by using those rollers and pushing your skin in certain directions, you're actually going to push liquid back into the lymphatics. And so it can cause depuffing. And that is probably one of the ways in which it happens is through that. And we know massage can do that, mechanical stimulation massage. The other thing that
very shallow, let's be clear, very shallow massage, because the lymphatic system is just...
No, the lymphatic system is everywhere.
It can be deep as opposed to okay.
Because you can have liquid.
The lymphatic massages that I've had, as in terms of relieving swelling from surgeries, they're just touching you very lightly.
Well, you just had surgery.
Well, no, but what they're saying is the lymphatic system is very shallow. So they're trying to move that fluid towards those valves, right? So that the body will excrete them. But again, but they're working very shallow. Yeah.
Well, it doesn't secrete them. It goes back into the blood. But there's lymphatics throughout your whole body because you can accumulate liquids throughout your whole body.
Through all depths. Okay. So in my case, it was shallow, but doesn't necessarily have to be shallow. So if somebody were using one of those rollers to that point right there, Thomas, and that's what they woke up and they were puffy, who knows, what they were doing the night before. Maybe they just had a nice sushi meal the night before, and they wake up and they look really puffy, and they've got to be on camera because they're doing this incredibly popular
does sushi do that to
and
you?
Exciting.
Soy sauce.
Soy sauce. Soy sauce does.
What I would
I've got
say
a little
is,
experience with
yeah.
that.
Right, sorry
would you
about
go
that.
in apply a certain level of pressure, or would you move in a certain direction to be able to influence that?
There are probably ways. I wouldn't say that I'm an expert in saying which direction is going to be best, and I'm not sure that that any one direction is going to be, necessary for it to be useful. Meaning, I'm sure that as long as you're, going in all directions, you're probably going to
applying that pressure, the reverse pressure back.
Yeah, I'm sure that you can find whatever just suits your face and what feels comfortable. Because part of what makes these things at all useful is that you enjoy doing it. Because when it's soothing, like if it's cold and soothing and stuff, it raises your mood. It elevates your mood. And so a lot of times, I hear people say, skincare is self-care, something along that nature. And part of it I do agree with is that if you do something that may not really have a lot of scientific oomph behind it, meaning it's not going to really, it's just something that makes you feel good about yourself. That's what like aromatherapy and such,
crystals.
Or crystals even. There's placebo involved in a lot of the things that people enjoy, like with puzzles, for instance, for some people, puzzles might be frustrating and raise their, blood pressure, where for me, it's intriguing and it actually calms me to be able to focus on something and clear my mind of other things. So this is one of the reasons why I think some of these gimmicks are actually not gimmicks in the sense that people enjoy themselves.
There's not value. There's not a gimmick in the sense that there's value
to it. There's value to it, yeah.
But not necessarily the value that they're claiming.
That's right.
Okay.
Well, it depends on what you think about it, as far as how long that benefit's going to last. Now, if you're
Sure.
expecting it to last for 10 minutes, then perfectly fine.
Yes.
If you're wanting to last
a lifetime.
hours or a lifetime, then you're going to be really disappointed.
Right,
Yeah.
and I do think you also have to consider, for instance, if you had a lot of salt the night before, by doing that you can, depuff slightly, but you still have a lot of salt in your body and you're still going to collect fluid. So really drinking a big glass of water is going to be better at helping you to get rid of that.
Okay.
And so that's where, again, like anything, is just understanding your own body, the physiology of your own body, talking to your physician or going to school. You're going to learn a little bit about what these things can actually, the limits of what these things actually do and what they don't do. One of the things that I particularly think they could be useful for is that I've had this kind of, I don't know if "bee in my bonnet's" the right phrase, but I've had this kind of thought for the longest time, which is, when you hear about putting like under eye serums on, you hear a lot of people say you should use your ring finger because that's the weakest finger, and you should just tap it into the skin.
Right.
And I'm going to use my ASMR voice.
And you are talking
And you
really
just
softly
tap it
when
into
you
the
say
skin.
that. Yeah.
No, but really, that's how I feel when I see that. I'm like, why? Why do I got to
You
tap
don't
it
want
into
to tug
the
at the
skin?
skin. You
But
don't want
see,
to. It's very
why?
delicate,
It's
is what they
fragile,
tell
though.
you.
Okay,
Yes,
well, that's
it's fragile.
But that's where I'm going to push back, because the thing is, it might be the thinnest skin of the face, but where do we find that we should be? And the reason why this kind of struck a chord was, I remember years ago when I heard this anecdote about a study that was done with women who wore brassieres and who didn't wear brassieres, and found that the women who wore brassieres actually ended up with more sag to their breast.
The French study.
The French study.
renowned French study.
Yeah, and so now I've since tried to like follow up and actually find that study, and found out it was only in the news that it was never like published on. So I don't know what that means, whether it was BS or not.
I know what that means. I think you do know what that means.
Regardless, I mean, maybe he passed away before it was finished. I don't know.
We just moved from skin science to something else all of a sudden.
Regardless, the reason I bring it up is not because it's factual necessarily, but it was what got me triggered to say, why would that be the case? And of course, the whole premise is that the body, in its desire to maintain what we call homeostasis, if doesn't have a need for strength or structural strength, it's not going to provide structural strength. So if you have something that's artificially holding something in place, then the body's going to say, I don't need to keep on putting something to hold it in place because it's already kind of there.
Wow.
Now, that being said,
You've given me a lot to think about, Thomas. You're really going to have to go home and think about this.
so regardless, that got me thinking about this, which is, maybe the reason why people have such delicate skin around their eyes as they age is because they've been patting it, and where everywhere else they're doing these rollers and stuff, and they're avoiding this area. So maybe there's something to putting a little bit of mechanical stress. And that's when I went into looking into the scientific literature, and actually found that I'm not that far off, and that there is indeed evidence, and quite a large amount of evidence, that shows that mechanical stress on the fibroblasts of the skin actually is required to maintain the youthful, not the phenotype, the youthful, what's the word for?
Continued expression of actually production of collagen. Which
Not just that, but also the shape of the fibroblasts, like
See that with
the
my-
morphology.
Yeah.
So the morphology, is basically the shape of a cell is the morphology, the way it looks, the color, the shape, all that stuff. And so if you look at a fibroblast under a microscope, it looks a little like a spindly, like there's little sharp like projections.
Yeah, spindle.
Yeah, spindly, yeah. Little spindles, I guess,
Yeah.
multiple spindles, spindle-eye. Or
Oh boy, here we go. We went from
but
spindly to spindle
the
eye.
spindle eye. I don't know. There's multiple spindles, or but when you look at a fibroblast that's in an aged cell that has a lot of laxity, it's actually a circular in shape, and that's because part of the reason it's spindly is because it actually attaches to things, and it like kind of holds on to, like it's holding on to different ropes. And so even in a petri dish, it'll adhere to the petri dish and have that spindly look when it's younger, until it becomes senescent and all that stuff. And so it's because of its ability to adhere to things that it has that shape. And so what we know is that there's studies that show that if you take engineered tissues and you actually apply pressure, it helps to maintain that young morphology or young shape and the amount of deposition of collagen that it continues to produce. If you don't give it that mechanical stretch or stress, it actually stops doing that. And so part of my thought process is, we know that in certain places of our skin, we lose fat underneath of it, and we lose volume, right? And so maybe some of that is the volume loss contributes to some of that laxity, because it's this feedback loop. And of course, this is all hypothesis at this point, but you lose that feedback loop, and then you lose the shape, or you lose the ability to produce collagen, which contributes to more laxity. And so my thought is, when I put things on under my eyes, I actually put it on just like that, where you actually don't pat it. You actually put pressure, because now when you look at the literature, the amount of pressure required is very small. Meaning, not saying that you can't put more pressure, it's just there's no reason to put, I think it's one Pascal.
Millipascal or Pascal?
Might be 1 Pascal, but I need to go back and look, because it could be millipascal. But
I'm not even sure what
so Pascal is
pressure that is.
Yeah, it's very light.
Okay,
and
so it doesn't take a lot. So, but just give it a movement to it, as opposed to just gently tapping it in.
So not only that, when you put serums on, they're typically slippery. You're not like using tacky serums usually. So when you're putting them on, you have already a lubrication. So you're providing not only lymphatic drainage, like we just talked about under the eye, where you're the puffiest. So you can, by putting that motion under your eyes with this lubrication from your serum, you're going to drive it in better, because you're putting pressure on it. You're going to get lymphatic drainage, and you get a slight amount of mechanical stress, which could, in theory, induce more strength to that tissue.
Okay.
And so, and we do know when you add more stress to certain tissues, like for instance, when somebody loses a leg and they put on their prosthetic, initially they get a lot of sores and tenderness in that area because of the added pressure, but their skin acclimates to that. The same would happen if you continue to put pressure in other areas. It actually is going to strengthen that area, become thicker. And isn't that what we want under the eyes? We want less crepiness, more, strength, more.
To a certain extent, yeah.
You don't want calluses on your eyes.
But sagging, yes.
But you're not going to like lift weights with your eye bags. You're not going to get calluses. And so that's kind of the point that I wanted to make there with that.
So a little mechanical stress and potentially some lymphatic drainage, which would reduce swelling or edema. So that's what Thomas has to say, Brian. What would you add to the conversation?
Well, I know that took like 20 minutes, so I'll cut it down to about 20 seconds. That's
why we love him.
Rude.
So the answer is yes, I would agree. Again, we mentioned before, there may be temporary benefits. Now, the discussion regarding the tension on tissues, I think you're right. You've seen that in vitro, but again, I think it's minor, more towards muscle cells, myocytes. But it could also be true for the fibroblasts and getting the production of collagen. I do know that they've done studies with these little devices that, essentially supposedly like chewing gum, or individuals chewing gum is supposedly make you look younger because it's building, you're constantly moving your jaw and in your cheek and everything like that. And they haven't really shown much benefit as far as anti-aging benefits. They may improve some of the muscle tone, but really as towards skin benefits, they haven't really shown that benefit. I know that that's studies that were done, in the 80s and 90s on that, and didn't essentially pan out. And that's why we're not, having devices that were, chewing gum or moving our jaw.
One where you put your mouth and go like that.
Yeah.
So muscle tone in the face doesn't necessarily translate to visually looking different on the skin, from the skin surface.
No, it would. I think more of what happened is that as we age, we can't develop as much muscle, even if we do more of those exercises. Just like we can't, the amount of certain tissues changes in different areas of our face. And so just like we talked about with collagen deposition in another podcast weeks and weeks ago, I think that, with the body, as we age, we can't produce as much as everything, other than inflammation and inflammatory stuff. But I think that's part of it, as well as the fact that, the skin is connected to the muscle much more tightly when we're young. And that connection is, you can think of it kind of like a string that's connecting the bone to the muscle, to the skin, and the bone to the skin. And those strings stretch out over time. And so it
affecting the underneath doesn't necessarily affect
not as much
the top layer. As you grow older. When you're younger, yes.
Right. Like, so if I have a rope, and if you've ever been belaying, like rock climbing, have you ever been belaying or rock climbing?
I've never even heard that word.
Okay, so when you can go to these gyms and actually you climb a rock,
but I didn't know
and
the name of it.
And so belaying is when you have a rope tied to you, and there's a person in the back that's anchored down, and they have to like give you slack when you're coming down,
Okay.
or when you're going up, they have to pick up the slack. And so it's like if you allow too much slack between you and them, if they fall, they're going to fall a big distance, and it could pick you up off the ground, and then it could be a catastrophe. So you're not supposed to allow any slack. So if they fall, they can't get momentum, and they'll just dangle there. And so it's like if you were climbing, the more you climb, if I don't take up the slack fast enough, it's going to accumulate more and more slack. So where by the time you fall, it's going to take me too long to get to that point. Where if I like when I'm younger, I don't have much slack. It's very taut. Where when I'm older, I have too much slack there. So that's the idea, is that there's a lot of slack in between, the supporting structures.
So if you take up some of the slack, you're not taking up enough to make a difference.
Make
in
a
what
difference
you see.
visually.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You might volumize a little bit,
Yeah.
Okay.
but you wouldn't.
So reduce puffiness, maybe add a little bit of a stress to the skin. What about blood flow? Or
Yeah. I mean,
anything in terms of, we talked about lymphatic drainage, but
Again,
what about blood
a very
flow?
temporary benefit.
Very temporary.
Yeah.
Okay.
Same with because people with the the ice cubes or the cold globes where you put in the refrigerator, or spoons. I've seen people use spoons to do this,
Yeah.
Under the eyes especially, and that does something similar to what caffeine would do as far as vasoconstriction, to reduce redness and puffiness, because the less blood flow you have to your face, the less it's going to leak out and cause puffiness. But again, to his point, it's going to be temporary. And also you have to ask yourself, with a lot of the modalities that we do, sometimes we want blood flow to our face to, get all the good stuff there. But regardless, it's all about what you're trying to accomplish.
Okay. So I think we've got a good answer to that. There is maybe some benefit.
Can I read a little blurb from this paper?
Transient? No.
Oh, geez, give her a little power. No,
Transient in nature, and certainly not the claims that are made that are associated with these
transient.
products, but certainly not going to hurt anything, and maybe some small benefit as well.
Right, and there's probably nothing special regarding being jade or being quartz or
No,
being
yeah,
stainless
Right. I
agree
versus
with that.
stainless steel versus being anything else. Or
Could do it with those spoons in the freezer
or
that Thomas
spoon,
was
yeah.
speaking of. Thomas, I will in fact let you share your paper.
It's,
ahead.
It is technical in nature, but I think it
Not
proves
surprised.
the point, because I think in this particular study, they took engineered human tissues and applied pressure to it, like I was talking about with the under the eyes. And basically what they say is that that they don't know. Basically, it's still a little bit up in the air. They don't really know what the role of tensional homeostasis, which is like keeping pressure, like just natural, always having pressure on the tissue, what that does for the aging of skin. But they say in this current study, we demonstrated that the tensional homeostasis induced in this tissue significantly increased expression of ECM, extracellular matrix, which is like collagen, elastin, hyaluronic acid, things of that nature, glycosaminous glycans, including collagen type 1 alpha, 1 chain, fibrillin, elastin, and MMP1. Furthermore, tension homeostasis stimulated not only dermal fibroblast function, but also epidermal keratinocyte proliferation and differentiation, which is what we use retinoids a lot for that turnover of cells as well, and cell acid and things of that nature, suggesting the presence of the epithelial mesenchymal interaction through this particular signal that they're talking about. So basically, it's upregulating a lot of these genes that we pay lots of money to upregulate. We use vitamin C because it upregulates collagen. We use retinoids because it turns over skin cells and it reduces reduce pigmentation and such. So essentially, by adding a little bit of stress to that skin, I would say you could possibly get some of those benefits that you would get from expensive creams.
Well, I may get that rose quartz roller out of the trash can then, and
Your finger. Just use your
put
finger.
it in
It's
the,
free.
Put it in the refrigerator.
Except for I'll charge you now
Yes,
because this is
yes.
my IP.
So, okay. So I think and I really do appreciate you going to the medical literature and
Yeah,
trying
sure
to
you
find a scientific
Again,
justification
sarcasm.
to the jade and quartz rollers. So let's move on to the next topic. And, this is taking a little bit of a step further. And this is something that we know a little bit about in our industry. In fact, we've distributed a product at one point in our history that utilized LED therapy for a particular reason that we were using it for. But LED therapy, whether that be red light is probably the most common that we see in the market. Blue light, we do see advertised some other colors of light. And these therapies are these devices claim to remove wrinkles and fine lines, to remove dark circles and spots, to also depuff, to energize the skin, to reduce inflammation. And in fact, in particular, blue LED light is said to be able to target and kill bacteria that cause inflammation and are in particular related to acne. So, and I think we've also seen too the red LED caps or brushes that have been. You're laughing.
Well, because you're just talking about all this propaganda. You're just
So all of
you're
that
part of
have
the
been
misinformation
associated with hair restoration as
No.
well. So LED therapy. Thoughts?
Yeah.
Thomas, would you like to take the
I have
first
so
stab?
many thoughts, but
Oh, boy, here
Brian,
we
I'll
go.
let Brian, you go first. But I have so many thoughts, and I will take up a lot of time. So I'll let you go first.
Okay. I think there's some benefit to certain wavelengths and certain intensities and certain duty cycles. Essentially, all that's important. So just an LED light that's blue may not necessarily be appropriate in seeing a benefit. There's a certain wavelength within that blue or near IR. You'll see some benefits in certain conditions. So you mentioned blue light for acne. There's been a number of papers on that that have shown some benefit. Very similar to what's seen with sal acid. So again, there's some data to support that, but again, it depends on. You just can't pick up any blue LED light.
Blue light and think that that's the same.
And that's going to be the same. Again, in the intensity of the light. So it's not. So you've got wavelength, you got intensity, and you have duty cycle. That all come into play as towards.
And duty cycle, Brian, is
how long they're lit. So for
how long they're lit. How long the cells are exposed to that light continuously.
So it's
correct?
essentially a sequence. So let's say for
Okay.
1 second, you need a 15% duty cycle. So a 15th of that second will be on the light, and the other 85 of that cycle, so again, 45 seconds would be off, 15 seconds would be on.
Okay. So we'll see in our industry, we'll see like, let's say in a medical spa or even a spa or a physician's office even. Dermatologists sometimes have the blue lights, but they're a panel. And
Right.
they're exposing the cells continuously to that blue light. And I'm certain if it's in a dermatology practice that it's of a certain wavelength and what was the other?
Well, wavelength, intensity.
Intensity.
So how bright it is.
And then it's a panel.
And then how often it cycles. Essentially, is it how much it's on and off within that given period of time.
So, but then you might see something sold directly to the consumer that might look something more like a wand and have a very small diameter where they're actually passing over the skin. It's not a continuous exposure of the cells to the blue light.
Right.
Would you anticipate that would work as well as something that was continuous?
Probably not. I
Okay.
mean, and that's to be expected. Again, if it's passing over and just only getting brief areas as far as getting intensity, and it may not be that intense as towards what's held in the hand versus what's found in a doctor's office. So again, I think there's some things that may work, and even in some areas, even the professional models may work versus not working at all in certain conditions. So again, I'd say for things like acne, yes. For things
Blue light in particular.
blue light. I haven't seen a whole lot that's shown as I know you mentioned the fact that capsid and the like is sort of seeing benefits there. I think that's still probably questionable. I think that when you're talking about some of the things like
What about red LED and inflammation, Brian?
there actually, I think there are some papers quite a bit of papers to talk about that reduction of inflammation, erythema, things like psoriasis. There's some papers that talk about benefits there.
It's mostly blue light for psoriasis, though, right?
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
And then talking about things like herpes or cold sores. There seems to be some benefits there towards reduction or turnover and regarding or reduction of cold sores. So, but things like
and how? Let's talk about a little bit about how the red LED in particular. How does just putting red light on the skin for a certain amount of time be able to affect inflammation and some of the other things that you talked about, Brian?
Well, again, we talked about a sort of cellular, expression of different types of genes and the like, and cell factors. And again, based on that, they can change their output as towards, instead of being an inflammatory stimulus, they get stimulus, or they get reduction of that stimulus through the interaction with the wavelengths.
So that red LED or blue LED,
Well,
red LED in particular, is actually affecting the gene expression.
in some cases. Now, again, the blue light is towards with acne is different. It's towards going with the porphyrins that are found within and reacting with the porphyrins. But again, some of the others is cellular activity.
Yeah, I think we need to back up and do one at a time because,
Okay, gets a little confusing
for instance,
going back and forth.
porphyrins,
Yeah.
that whole story needs to be kind of teased apart a little bit for people to understand really what that is. But the red light thing, there's actually a deeper story, and we do need to be careful because when you look at the electromagnetic spectrum and the spectrum of light and such, it's a broad spectrum, and reds have quite a broad spectrum, as so does blues and violets. And so, for instance, there's a difference. So the like ultraviolet, and there's a line between where you're ultraviolet, where you have like ionizing radiation, versus the color purple, right, or color blue. And so then there's the red, and then there's a line between the color of red and infrared or near infrared. And so the real kind of purpose I'm making this distinction is because the specific wavelength, and Brian did allude to this or even said it, is very important in whether or not it's going to make a difference. And the reason is because just like with a laser that you're trying to either remove a tattoo or get rid of your hair, the light has to find what's called a chromophore. So there's something that is going to react or absorb, or something's going to happen with specific wavelengths. A reaction is going to happen
In a certain level of the skin,
right?
right? Yeah.
Right. And so anybody that does like there's a certain set of experiments that I don't want to get into because you'll get mad at me for being too technical. But you basically use what's called I'm drawing a blank, a photo. A UV a spectrophotometer. And so basically it allows you to take any substance and put it into a little glass vial, run some certain wavelengths of light to it, and see what gets absorbed and what doesn't and such. And you can actually see a wave that shows you what are the wavelengths that are the peak wavelengths that either absorb or reflect or whatever there. And it tells you a lot about the property of any given molecule. And so in our bodies, in every cell of our bodies, we have a whole ton of molecules that get excited at certain places. And there's a phenomena called photolysis or photolysis. Photolysis. I don't know if it's pronounced one way or the other, but it's exactly what it sounds like, which is that light induces some sort of breakage of a bond of something that allows something to free a certain molecule. And, Jose, Dr. Maldonado, actually in the back there, because I want to call, he's falling asleep. I want to make sure that he's paying attention. But Dr. Maldonado, Jose, you mentioned when we talked about the red light before, you mentioned that it affects what in our bodies, and then it's similar to what?
Yeah, so when we were talking about the mitochondria that we find in our cells. The mitochondria, you probably remember the powerhouse. It's probably everybody remembers it for. And it produces this molecule called ATP, which is really beneficial for that molecule is used throughout the body. So it needs to be, our mitochondria needs to produce a lot of it. It needs to do it efficiently. So that molecule can be distributed across the body so the body can carry out its functions.
Okay, but you said it was like something else in nature.
So, when people are asking me this, I'm like, how does a light affect us? I'm like, well, just remember, there's plants out there. Plants can take energy from the sun, light energy, and convert that into chemical energy to their food.
Right. And so now I want to make clear that I don't believe that we do
Photosynthesis.
photosynthesis. But in a
It's
sense,
an analogy.
in a
yes.
sense, there is some, because the thing is, when you look at the mitochondria in human cells and the chloroplasts, which are the green, what makes plants green, in plants that actually are what does photosynthesis, they're actually very similar in the way that they work, in the way that some of their structure as well. But
Yeah, so it's still the photoabsorption that occurs,
Right.
just like but photosynthesis is towards producing in plants is towards energy. I mean, you're still getting photoabsorption in these different molecules within the cells.
Right. And so, without getting into major detail, because when you take a class like biochemistry, you have to memorize like what's called the Krebs cycle, and there's other ways in which the body produces energy. And it's a very laborious thing to do because there's a lot of different steps that a little enzymes that turn into a different molecule, and then something else comes in and makes another molecule. And the goal is to make what Jose talked about, which is ATP and also NAD or NAD.
Mm-hmm.
And so these molecules then are either what's called oxidized or reduced. And so that's a fancy way of saying that they're spent or not. So they're like batteries in the sense that these NAD molecules then can be reduced to NADH, and then they can be oxidized to NAD and plus. And so am I saying it right?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah,
And so I always
NADH.
want to look at Brian because sometimes I say the backwards thing and he always lets me know.
Yeah.
But this is important to know. I know it's a little technical, but it's important to know because the reason why these red lights work, and it's still kind of up in the air. There's still a lot yet to be known, but it's thought that the mitochondria, which which Jose was talking about, there's certain proteins on there called cytochromes. And these cytochromes actually are essential for the cycles that make these molecules that produce energy for us. But like we said, when these cytochromes are either oxidized or reduced, the same as those other molecules, they can either produce more of those molecules or not produce them. And so it's thought that there's certain molecules that these cytochromes in their reduced state will actually hold on to. And the red light at these intense wavelengths, now we know that it happens with ultraviolet wavelengths. So ultraviolet wavelengths will actually cause these cytochrome molecules or proteins to release a substance called nitric oxide. So I don't know if we've talked about nitric oxide before. Okay, so nitric oxide is a super interesting molecule. It's something that somebody won the Nobel Prize for discovering, because it is one of those things that it's two molecules, and it basically is a very small molecule, but it's an essential one for the body to function. It does vasodilation, but it's also used, so it basically in small amounts allows our body to constrict its blood vessels. And so that's one of the reasons that we think it's actually useful for anti-aging, and we'll talk about that in a second, but also in large amounts, it's used by our immune system to kill bacteria. And so, but I actually did my dissertation on what nitric oxide does on human genetics in large amounts, and it's actually a mutagen, a pretty powerful mutagen. And so the body produces it, but it's in a delicate balance, just like most things. And that's why when we talk about slathering growth factors and stuff, you wonder, should you really be doing that? Because the body produces things like nitric oxide in small amounts for a reason. And so we have to really think through why we put certain things on the body in large amounts. Now, that being said, nitric oxide is produced by enzymes that we have 3 enzymes in our body that produce nitric oxide when it's called for. We won't get into all that either. I actually I used to make people that applied for positions, Brian was one of them, give talks on nitric oxide because it's something that not a lot of people are experts on, but it gives me an ability to see how they react to subject matter that they may need to learn about and that I know about. And
Brian must have done well.
He did do well. And so anyway, the nitric oxide is made by those in small amounts, but there's also a lot of molecules throughout our body and a lot of them in our skin that actually, when they're photolysed, so when certain UV rays hit us, it releases the nitric oxide, and it's part of what happens when we go into the sun. And it's part of our body's defense mechanism as well. But the problem is all the benefits that we get from nitric oxide in small quantities in our skin, which are very, they're great. Because I'm sorry, I said vasoconstriction, didn't I?
It's vasodilation.
Yeah, it's vasodilation. So I'm glad that
edit that out.
No, we can keep
I'm
it in.
kidding.
The thing is, it is vasodilation, and that's one of the reasons why, like, for instance, it's great because, for instance, for hair, you talked about using the red light on the hair. That's one of the reasons why it would be beneficial, because it would dilate the blood vessels.
Bring blood flow
bring
into
blood
the
flow,
follicles.
which is one of the things that DHT does against us. It constricts those.
Constricts, okay.
Yeah. So it's actually legitimate that if this is indeed what's happening, because what they found is they know UV does it, but they're also thinking that near infrared and infrared actually does the same thing, and it actually causes the release of the skin store of this nitric oxide without having to go through the enzymatic process of creating it.
Okay.
And so it then is going to cause some benefit.
So
Right, and that goes along with also the antiviral possibilities as far as in the fact there was just a paper that came out this week talking about
Because it brings immunity to the...
correct. Well, it actually, it's antiviral, so they're talking about not only the fact of topically applying towards for different diseases that are viral as towards on the skin, but also we talked about earlier that may be beneficial for herpes, cold sores. And so at least it's shown in the literature, and that may be through nitric oxide.
Right, because it's bringing more blood flow, more immune cells
yeah.
to that site, and allowing it to clear the infection more readily. And so going back to the one last point on that is that in particular, through several studies, they've shown that it's not the total dose of the light. So sitting under it, if it's not the right intensity, which Brian said brightness, which is correct, but we call it like fluency because it's like delivery of joules of energy,
Correct, yeah.
which in light sources can be brightness, but if it's infrared, it wouldn't be visible, so you wouldn't call it brightness.
Okay.
And also with UV, you don't see it, so you'd call it fluency because it's the amount of energy that's being produced. But that is more important than how long. It's so the intensity is more important than the length of the dose.
Depending on what you're attempting to accomplish, right? Because those lights, I hadn't really kind of put that together, but UV obviously affects cells
we don't
in the
want to
body.
slip into that.
Yeah, and then infrared or near infrared, which is what LED therapy is utilizing, correct?
Red LED.
Red LED, and then you've got lasers as well. All of those are different levels of light energy and wavelength.
That's
and
correct.
Intensity
That's correct.
to address certain things.
That's
in
correct,
the
but
body.
I'm talking about if it's going to release nitric oxide. And it needs a specific intensity. Now, you could do more, like with a laser, but the thing is, that's not going to release nitric oxide necessarily. It's just going to ablate the tissue.
But in general, red LED therapy.
So I guess what I'm trying to say is you could take a really weak light of the wavelength and stick it on you for countless hours, and it may not do anything for you.
Yeah.
So that's why when you buy it from Amazon or something, it may have an accurate wavelength, but if it's not powerful enough, it may not do anything for you.
Okay.
And that's where you really need to be careful. We're not saying that this is a gimmick. We're saying that we're still trying to figure out how it works and the utility to best use it. But what we do know is that if you do buy into it, to make sure that the product that you're using allows for you to really get any potential benefit by making sure it's powerful enough. And that's usually through a physician's office,
Right.
unfortunately.
Yeah.
Although there are some items on the market that claim to be able to do this, and that's really on the onus of the company to prove that.
So again, we can say that LED therapy, whether it's red light or blue light for different indications, may have some effect on the skin based on what we just talked about. There are some things you would want to be aware of before you would invest in these devices or procedures. It may not necessarily be all of the claims that you see attached to some of these procedures or to these devices as well. Again, because some devices just simply don't have the wavelength or intensity
The power.
or the
right?
power to be able to affect that level of change. Your best bet would be to go into a physician's office if you're interested in LED therapy, red or blue, and have a discussion with them about what device they use for that. And
I
what
would
they can
agree with
anticipate
that, but I would also say that, thank you. I would agree with that, but I would also say that, the physicians that are listening should make sure that they too understand how these devices work so that they don't end up buying into a device and spending a lot of money on a device that may not help their patients. it's pretty easy to test because the ones that are cleared through the FDA, and they're supposed to be, if they make any of these indications like for wrinkles or hair loss or anything like that,
or
acne, and so they have to basically prove to the FDA that their fluence is high enough, and so you can check that literature. So don't save money by getting something that's not cleared, because then you can't validate it. That's the part that's why companies spend the money to go through that process, not only because it's the right thing to do, but also because it gives the physician the ability to look and make sure that
confidence. Yeah.
But with the blue lights, really quickly with the porphyrins, I do want to make the caveat here that Brian quickly talked about porphyrins, and for the people who don't know what that means, I want to really quickly explain that certain bacteria on the face that we all probably have heard of, formerly as P. acnes, now they're called C. acnes, they can produce porphyrins. Porphyrins is a type of molecule that is light sensitive, and when you put certain wavelengths of light against it, it actually causes a free radical production. And that is not great for our cells, but it's also not great for the bacterial cells. And so we know that the bad forms of C. acnes, because we also know there are really great forms of C. acnes that you absolutely need and want, and we can talk about that on another episode. But I think we already have.
I think we may have
multiple times. But the ones that are associated with things like acne, they actually produce the most porphyrins. And so if you use a blue light that actually causes those free radicals from the porphyrins, you're more likely to eradicate a lot of the ones that are in the vicinity, which are the ones that produce them. But you have to be careful, because you're also going to cause free radical damage to your own cells. So that's just a warning as far as the blue light, and making sure that you also walk into that knowing kind of what you're doing as well.
Okay.
And the dermatologists I talked to about utilizing the blue light in their offices, they use it kind of as a supplement. And it also comforts the patient that they know that they're getting another treatment to help improve it. I don't think that any of them would agree that it's a standalone.
Right.
As I would suggest the same with the red LED for hair restoration.
Sure.
It's typically physicians who are in the hair restoration market, they're using many different modalities to affect hair restoration in different ways at different levels.
Yeah.
And that may just be one little thing that they add to it for.
Seems to be a common theme about what we talk about, is that there's not very many times in aesthetics or in dermatology where you can just throw one thing at something.
A silver bullet, yeah.
And it's because biology is complicated.
Yep. And we're getting near to the end, but I just want to ask one last question as we wrap up, and we'll keep this one very brief, gentlemen. But I love this topic.
No, it's a good topic.
And that just goes back to the good old beauty sleep, and is there in fact, and what we know is it goes really back to we were the average person refers to it as beauty sleep, but we know it's actually tied to circadian rhythms. So just a brief explanation from a scientist perspective on circadian rhythms and how making sure that we're getting our beauty sleep, as we would call it, is affecting the aging process, or is it not?
All right, I say 2 minutes each. You go first.
Okay, I've got the clock started.
I think there's some papers. I think even Howard Maybach did some work on that, looking at circadian rhythms and looking at barrier function. And I think there was some improvements in barrier function when
skin barrier function,
and lessening or having worse barrier when you got less sleep. So again, I think there is some benefits to that. I know there's a number of companies that talk about that as towards why they have a morning and night type products to match the circadian rhythms of individuals. So I think there's some data out there that supports that. I don't know if it makes a huge difference as towards being either old or young in regarding trying to match it up or optimize that, but certainly it's the case in which just overall health, it's good to have. Again, unless we've talked about before, so Elon Musk is towards, I think, only sleeps 3 hours a day or something like that. You're probably going to be wanting to have your 7 or 8 hours of sleep for the best benefit.
Is it time?
He's
is
a lizard
it quality? Person. Is it, I've heard it said that you need to be asleep between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. because that's when your body does the most restoration. I've heard that from my Pilates instructor, who also practices holistic medicine. But, is there some truth to that? Is it time, the time of the day that you're sleeping? Is it the duration Or is it just the quality? Are you getting into a deep enough sleep?
I think there's some more complication to that as towards sleep, and because your body temperature changes as towards when you sleep as well. So I think that may have an effect regarding enzyme activity or biological activity as towards as your temperature changes within your body. So I think it may be more than just between 10 and 2 that but I don't know enough detail to say it needs to be, 11:45 to 3 a.m. or something like that. But again, there are differences in regarding activities within the body over a given sleep cycle, and optimal times as towards for benefit towards skin versus digestion or mental health or whatever the case may be.
Okay.
Well, he actually just touched on a very important point, and that was over 2 minutes, so I get over 2 minutes too.
Okay.
When you think about sleep, you hit the nail on the head with circadian rhythm. And so I don't think everybody knows what that is, but really briefly, our body every 24 hours goes through certain cycles, and there's different things that are cyclical. One of them, for instance, is blood pressure. And so, for instance, our blood pressure spikes when we wake up and ambulate in the morning, which means rise when we get up on our feet. And so, for instance, a lot of people will take their blood pressure medication at night because they'll know that it'll be active by the time morning comes around. It's because the morning, when you first wake up, that's the number one time people have heart attacks because your blood pressure spikes when you get up. And so there's a lot of things that happen on a circadian rhythm, and it's why when you just got back from Barcelona and you felt it, you felt that your body was used to sleeping and waking up at a certain point, and it didn't like the fact that you were causing it not to. And part of what actually drives it is...
Oh boy, here we go.
The microbiome. So
it
I mean,
always finds a way.
Well, the thing is, there's a reason I always find a way because we're so linked together with our microbes. And one of the things that you touched on was the diet, the times that we eat. That's very important, and that's why they say not to do midnight stacks and not to eat. It's not just because you gain weight and all that stuff or metabolize it differently. It's because when you eat things, your gut microbes actually are secreting certain molecules, and some of those are neurotransmitters or things that affect neurotransmitters. And so there are certain things that are produced by the gut, and not just the gut, but the skin as well. And one of them is short-chain fatty acids. It's one of the things that's found very prevalently on the skin. One of them is propionic acid, and there's butyric acid, and there's other short-chain fatty acids that actually can have a huge impact on the secretion of things like neurotransmitters. And so the production of short chain fatty acids are a lot of times made by your microbes. And those microbes are going to take cues from when you eat, when you shower, when you do certain things, when you exercise, and all that stuff feeds into the rhythm that your body functions because it's used to functioning a certain way. So you do something, your gut gets, your microbes get a certain stimulus, they do something, which in turn makes you want to do something, and it's a cycle, and it contributes to the circadian rhythm. Additionally, you have the light that also contributes to your circadian rhythm. It's why a lot of times, if you have a window, you'll wake up when the sun comes up, and you'll wake up earlier in certain times of the year than other times of the year, or you'll fall asleep better when the lights are out and such. And so people that live in areas where it's always bright for months at a time, they go a little nuts because their circadian rhythm doesn't have a chance to establish itself.
Yeah.
And so this is where I'd say you're right. It's the rhythm of sleep. I think that's more important. So I'm not a sleep expert.
Is everybody's rhythm the same, or people, for instance, people who work a graveyard shift, so they work the night shift?
No, not everybody's the same.
So they could have a rhythm just like everybody else. It's simply their rhythm is different, and as long as they maintain that rhythm, then things are going to operate appropriately.
And you measured Elon Musk, or who measured him?
Somebody.
So he's a lizard person, so he's separate. He's separate than all this. But the thing is, not everybody has the same patterns. So during our sleep, and I'm not a sleep expert, that's my disclaimer, but I do know that you can buy little trinkets, like there's one called an Oura ring, and what it'll do is it'll measure your pattern of sleep, and it's a full pattern. So you have multiple patterns throughout the night, and I think it's 2 or 3.5 hours. For some people, it's 3 hours for some people. And it's about fulfilling a cycle and not entering into another cycle, because that's what gets you your beauty sleep.
Okay.
And you feel rested. And so for sometimes with my cycle, I opt to wake up an hour plus early because I know I'll be more groggy and more hard to get going if I try to get an extra hour of sleep, because I'll be in mid-cycle. And so it's understanding, and
It's
that's where
understanding your cycles.
and then just you can't get away with just one cycle. You have to have multiple cycles because your body does need to recover. But knowing your body and what your body requires, you can find that information out if you invest a little bit.
So there may be something, bottom line, there may be something there is something to beauty sleep, but it has to do with circadian rhythms. So if you wanted to take advantage of really maximizing that opportunity, you would have to understand your rhythms and maintain your rhythms.
Right, and just getting sleep in general is very important.
And getting sleep
getting
in general.
proper
I
rest.
have actually worked with a sleep expert, and one of the things that she shared with me was the value of a power nap, but only a power nap, 20 minutes, not long naps in the afternoon, because that does throw off your circadian rhythms.
And it also makes you more tired. So.
Yeah, so I think that's a good place to stop because
right.
I've grown a little tired myself. So,
Okay. But anyway,
I'll turn it back over to you,
all right.
Thomas.
So the
I'll hand you
power,
back the keys.
I have the power.
The castle.
The power of Grayskull. Nobody that's my age is gonna, or younger than me, is gonna know that. But anyway, we thank you for your eyes and ears. We hope you learned something today. If you want to find more information or give us a shout out as far as what you'd like to hear about, you can find us on Crown's website at crownlaboratories.com, or you can speak directly to me at my socials at dr.t.hitchcock. That's dr.t.hitchcock. And that's mainly Instagram there. But we appreciated our discussion today, and we hope to see you back next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.